Hello, everybody, and welcome to first lecture of the beast that is Unit 5. And in Unit 5, we're going to focus on topics 5.1, 5.2, and then jump all the way to topics 5.17. Basically, we'll be looking at forestry uh, and a concept of tragedy of the commons. All right, so major focus for Unit 5, or two focuses, are the one, when humans use resources, we end up altering natural systems in some way. But second major enduring understanding is that humans can mitigate their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use. All right, please read. So from chapter 1, this is where the tragedy of the commons concept is addressed. It comes up on page 4 when it talks about the North Atlantic cod, but then again on pages 18 through 20. But your more robust reading assignment will pop up in section 10.1, pages 266 through 278, where that will take you through kind of the impacts of deforestation along with sustainable forestry practices. All right. Um, so tragedy of the commons. This is a top 2 or 5.1. In fact, I'm not going to give it a whole lot of time because the man, gentleman, or person, I should say, credited with doing it, he's a white supremacist, and I don't want to give credence to his ideas, but there are some important uh, things that come out of his writing. All right, so. Solving environmental problems is the result of a struggle between short-term welfare and long-term environmental stability and societal welfare. Um, so basically, there is a tendency for individuals. So let's say we have a public or common resource that you don't own it. Nobody else really owns it. It's just there and available to everybody. There is a tendency for individuals to exploit that resource for their own gain, um, even though it might have a negative impact on the long-term stability of that resource. So, like forests, for example, if you are in the business of cutting down trees and selling uh, that off for timber, right? If you don't own the land from which those trees come, there's a direct incentive for you to cut down as many trees as you can so that you can sell more to make a direct profit, right? So the forest would be what we call a commons or a common resource in that case, right? The short-term welfare would be cutting down as many trees as you can to make as much profit as you can, but understanding that that is not going to work in the long term. We're eventually going to cut down trees faster than they can regrow, and we run out of that resource. So that is the idea behind the tragedy of the commons. The basic idea is it leads to resource depletion and a rapid degradation of that resource. Okay, so the basic lesson is that public resources need to be managed in order to prevent overexploitation, right? So, and that is why we have like the Bureau of Land Management and the United States Forest Service, right? They basically have principles and permits they apply to make sure that it's just not free, open access to use however you want for your own benefit, while you might be causing the degradation of that resource for other people. The idea is we have agencies involved that manage it to make sure that we cut down trees at a certain rate, replant them at a certain rate, and therefore we have a more managed and sustainable system, right? So that's the basic lesson of the tragedy of the commons, all his other white supremacist nonsense aside. All right. So that's all the credence I'm going to give the tragedy of the commons. But let's talk about forests. Forests are important, and we know why forests are important. So this is a review of some stuff way back to Unit 1 and 2. All right. So ecosystem services provided by our forests are things like clean air and water. They help to maintain soil quality and maintain watersheds, as we just talked about back in Unit 4. They are essential habitat for thousands or millions of different species. And they play an important role in climate moderation, partly to do with the actual hydrologic cycle itself, in the sense that they absorb a lot of water and evapotranspire that back to the atmosphere. All right. Um, Trees and vegetation can actually have a direct impact on the amount of precipitation, but also they're an important carbon sink, meaning they take carbon out of the air um, to power their cellular processes, but a lot of that carbon remains locked up in their biomass, all right, and out of the atmosphere. And so when we get to our climate change unit later on, uh, we'll talk more specifically about carbon's role in climate change. All right, so deforestation, as the name implies, is a temporary or permanent clearing of large expanses of forest, often for agricultural use, but also for industrial wood fiber and timber and things like that. Um, so between 2000 and 2005, the world's forests shrank by 90 million hectares. All right. Um, and the direct human impacts on that, fire, right, which are exacerbated by uh, human practices of fire suppression, oddly enough, okay, but also by extended droughts and land clearing practices. Expansion of agriculture, primarily in the tropics, construction of roads, tree harvest, but also insects and disease, which there are some direct links to human activities and how they're impacting which insects end up in which forests, like some invasive species, for example, but also climate change is impacting which insects and pest species invade different forests. Um, in the US, so if we were to take a look at where forests would be naturally in the US before humans came in and cleared anything, so back in 1620, when there weren't a whole ton of people in the US, all those green areas are where our forests existed. Now, if we fast forward 200 years to, or 300 years, excuse me, to 1920, we'll see that many of those forests were heavily cleared, clear cut and used for the variety of purposes we just mentioned. Again, that's a direct result of this huge public resource that seemed endless, and people, again, essentially making use of that resource for their own direct benefit without much of an eye on the long-term health of that. Now, it didn't take long, though, after this time for the government and people that rely on forests to wake up and say, wait a minute, if we keep going at this rate, there's going to be no forest left. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants there to be no forest left. So we implemented things like the Bureau of Land Management and the United States Forest Service, and we had a more systematic way about providing permits for logging companies to go to a certain parcel of land, log that land, but leave certain trees behind, replant trees, and so on. And as a result, if we fast forward 80 years to the year 2000, notice that many of our forests have in fact recovered. So lesson here is in the US, forests, most of our forests are either steady or in many cases actually expanding. Good news, right? Um, now, I'm going to fast forward one slide really fast. Now, I do want to point out the fact, though, that simply replanting trees, yes, a forest will reestablish itself, but we have to remember the processes of primary and secondary succession. So after clear cutting, for example, we would undergo secondary succession. So we already have soil in place, right? But it is going to take tens to hundreds of years to really fully establish that, what they might call climax community. And in the case of the western part of Washington and Oregon, right, we have and California, we have what are called old growth forests, right? And so, but to reestablish an old growth forest habitat, it's not just simply a matter of having the trees and letting them grow up. Um, there are a variety of conditions. There's a variety of ages of trees, a variety of different species. Um, and there are actually a lot of specialist species that really only survive well in those old growth habitats, right? So yes, our forests are either steady or expanding, but we've lost a large percentage of these old growth forest habitats. They are still around in patches because we did manage to put a stop to their exploitation before they were all gone. So the coastal redwoods, and sequoia forests. We also have some old growth forests in Oregon and Washington as well. But there's not very many left. All right. Now, deforestation, as we learned about a little bit in our discussion of watersheds last unit, right? But if we clear cut an area, right, we're going to end up with decreased soil fertility, right? We're going to have more soil erosion, And the forests, of course, play a really important role in maintaining our watersheds. So notice that in the case of forestry here, they left a lot of trees behind. That's what's called selective cutting, by the way. Okay, versus clear cutting, removing all trees, we can help to maintain a clear stream, still harvest some trees, right? Uh, and it help to maintain soil quality, help reduce soil erosion, and so on. So later on, when we start talking about sustainable forest methods, right? Uh, selective cutting will be an important part of that. Okay, but understanding that removing trees uh, has big impacts on soil quality, but also our forests are super important habitat. So habitat loss, as you guys know, is the number one cause of species loss. All right. But again, we have that link to global climate change, and forests are an important part of that. All right. Now let's go down to the tropics. So near the equator. Uh, Forest trends in the tropics, it's a much more bleak landscape right now, sadly. Okay, so here in temperate regions, Europe and the US, right, we've got policies in place to protect our forests, still being, cut down and using a variety of methods, but by and large, steady or expanding. Okay, not the case in the tropics, not the case by a long shot, right? Our tropical rainforests are disappearing at an alarming, scary, alarming rate. All right. Now, the reasons for that are various, but a lot of them have to do with agriculture, right? There's what's called subsistence agriculture. We haven't gotten to how we define agriculture yet, but subsistence agriculture would be essentially you clear land and you farm and grow food simply to feed your family. It's not the industrialized agriculture where you have hundreds or thousands of acres and then you're selling wheat or corn on the open market. Subsistence agriculture is basically clearing land, having enough food to feed yourself and your family. All right. Commercial logging, much like up here in the US. Cattle ranching. Now, as regions become more industrialized, right, they're starting to eat a higher percentage of their diet is going to be coming from meat, right? Cattle require a ton of land, all right? And if they're trying to raise cattle in the tropics, there's not a ton of open grasslands. And so they'll clear forests to create pastures for cattle, right? Oil palm, it is an ingredient in all kinds of things out there. So palm trees grow in the tropics, right? So the oil palm is a variety of palm tree, but basically they will clear cut uh, vast areas of our most productive ecosystem on land, right? And replace it with a monoculture of oil palms. All right. And then, of course, like mining and hydroelectric power as they go through the industrialization process, they're clearing forests for those causes as well. Um, Now, also in the tropics, we often think of the tropics as being wet, right? But there are what we call tropical dry forests, where their climatic conditions do not produce nearly as much rainfall. So they might be on a rain-shadowed side of the mountains, for example, in the tropics. All right. So temperature-wise, still very warm, but they're much drier than our tropical rainforests, and they are still considered forests, but much sparser, right? And there's not a whole lot separating a tropical dry forest from a desert. A lot of it has to do with soil quality. So in our tropical dry forests, it's not so much industrial processes and agriculture as it is cutting down trees and using them simply for fuel, for heating and cooking. Uh, but take a note there that that desertification process we talked about in Unit 4 is a big concern in our tropical dry forests. All right, and then we go way up north to Russia and Canada. Our largest biome on the planet is those boreal forests. Um, so primary scare there is not for agricultural purposes, but here in the U.S., our forests are steady or expanding. That is not because of a reduced use of timber. Um, we're getting our timber from like tree plantations in a lot of cases, but we're also just going up way up north where we don't see it. Uh, and there's vast clear cuts. The boreal forest, while it is the largest biome in the world, it is being exploited at a pretty alarming rate, much like the tropical rainforests. All right. So last slide that we're going to cover for right now, we're going to get into sustainable forestry or sustainable forest management, right? The ultimate goal, right, is working toward being able to utilize the important provisioning services that forests provide, right? We still need timber, right? Um, and so on, but without really overly compromising the overall health of that system. Okay, so that's the goal of sustainable forestry, and a lot of that comes down to, uh, you know, planned harvesting of trees. Over cycles of decades, you come and harvest, replant, come back and reharvest. But it also comes down to different techniques, right? So there's clear cutting, but there's also processes like the selective cutting I mentioned on an earlier slide. So a focus for in class for us is we're going to spend some time on the pros and cons of different timber harvesting techniques. So we will definitely explore this idea of sustainable forestry to a larger degree, but we're just going to be doing that together in the classroom. So until then, make sure you guys get the reading done from that second slide and be ready to discuss these things.